All right, welcome to our show. We're going to spend the whole show today with one very fascinating writer. You may know him. His name is Chuck Klosterman. His new book is called Raised in Captivity, a series of hypnotic essays. Well, they're not essays either. They're short stories that have some basis in reality, but also some basis in non-reality. They're very hard to describe, as you're probably noticing. He's written lots of books, and he's been the ethicist for the New York Times magazine for 3 years. He is one of the original founders of the website Grantland, along with Bill Simmons and James Madison. I believe those were the three founders of Grantland. And we're very excited to have him here. So, Chuck Klosterman, welcome to our show.
Hey, it's great to be on it.
So I want to talk about this book and these essays. Everybody seems to struggle to find a way to describe what these essays are, and everybody winds up doing sort of these kind of hybridized things. I came up with Italo Calvino and Mark Lehner co-write a Black Mirror episode, or a whole series of Black Mirror episodes. But there's sort of a way in which you begin in reality most of the time, and then something happens. Something happens where our basic idea of reality is shaken, whether it's a football coach a high school football coach who only runs one play, forces his team to run one play over and over again, and it later turns out that has had a cumulative effect on their minds in certain ways. Or a band that discovers that one of its older songs is being downloaded and covered and slathered over by white supremacists. So I don't know, maybe you could just say a little bit about your approach. These are a little bit different from other stuff you've written.
Oh, it is. And I appreciate all the descriptions you use. That would be great if that was the case. I don't know if it is, though. I mean, I suppose these are, terrestrial science fiction in the sense that there's elements of science fiction, but they're not happening in space. Like, I'm not on a space station. I'm not on Mars. They're happening on Earth. Technically they are short stories, although I'm always a little hesitant to say that because I'm afraid someone might be listening to this and being like, oh, I love short stories. I like Lori Moore. I like George Saunders. I'm going to buy this. It's not like that, okay? Right. Traditionally in short story writing, like if we were at like a creative writing program at a college, they would say, okay, here's what you do. You start with characters, and the character must evolve. And the character evolves with these plot mechanics. And from that, from what we see, the change we see in the principal character and the actions and the hinge points in the mechanics, from that an idea or a kind of a theme emerges. I work backwards. Like I start with the idea. And similar to essay writing, the idea is to kind of have every part of the piece just kind of serve this kind of hypothetical question. The characters in my stories, because they're so short, they don't really evolve. I mean, they're more like the characters in like a Hitchcock film where it's a character type. Mm-hmm. And that I think if someone is reading these stories, they're like, I've met a person like this, or I understand a person like this. And then the thing that happens in the story, it's usually that we're based in reality that's just like ours, except for one thing being different, and that's what the story is.
And I have to say that for the most part, the outlook of these stories, I'm looking all the way through for the common thread. The outlook of these stories is not particularly hopeful. I would say somewhat pessimistic. Things are, for the most part, not going well. If it's set in some imagined, slightly distant future, things have gotten worse. Wikipedia has merged with the public school system. Maybe you could say a little bit about that, too. Is that just being pessimistic for fun, or are you really feeling that dark right now?
Well, that's a hard question because, sometimes people like to present themselves as being cynical, right? They'll be like, oh, I'm a cynic. But of course, an actual cynic would never think that way. An actual cynic who actually thought the world was bad would think they're a pragmatist.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you say I'm a pessimist or I'm an optimist or whatever, you're kind of projecting how you want to be seen. I guess I don't feel that way. I mean, these stories to me are mostly funny, all right? Like, yes. I mean, to me, that's the hope. Now, I will concede that the reception of these stories is that they are very nihilistic and dark. I didn't think that when I wrote them. I mean, I understand why this happens. I understand how that works. I mean, there are only there's 34 stories in the book, and only a couple of them, I would say, end with a happy ending in a conventional sense. I kind of write about what I daydream about. Maybe my daydreams are sad. I don't know.
I really like the idea, though, that you're worried people are going to go back to the bookstore and say, wait a minute, these are nothing like John Cheever.
Yeah.
These are, I want my money back.
Well, that's why, the subtitle of this book, it's like almost consciously confusing because it's like fictional nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, what is fictional nonfiction? Well, it's the same as non-fictional fiction. It's fiction. Okay. But if I didn't want to just put stories at the bottom, which is what the publisher often wants you to do, like to say like a novel or short stories or whatever, I thought that was, for one thing, boring. And I also, it's not like I'm claiming that I'm doing something no one's done before. I know other people have, but it does feel a little different than what is usually presented as this genre of writing, and it could be just because I'm not that good at it. I can't write the way that other writers do, so I have to kind of make up my own style, kind of. Sometimes you'll see this with guitar players who didn't take guitar lessons, and then people go like, "Well, how did you develop this?" And he's like, "Well, I couldn't do what the other people were doing, so I just did this."
Joni Mitchell, I mean, she couldn't read music. Yeah. She didn't know how to. I mean, all of her
Beatles couldn't read music,
right? But I mean, all of Joni's tunings were just made up by Joni. So. One of the things that I see popping up in a few of these pieces, and they are very funny, by the way, I wouldn't want to suggest that they are merely dark. They are very funny. Is a sort of an idea that we're living in an information economy and an information saturated environment, but a lot of the information is wrong and very fungible, very easily overturned. There's one where scientists studying nutrition discovered that basically everything they've ever thought about nutrition is wrong. The only thing that's important is how close to being alive the thing is that you're eating. So like an apple that you could eat while it's still growing on a tree would be way more valuable, and a regular apple's almost worthless, or an apple pie is worthless. There's another one where a guy wants to break up with his significant other, and he finds some research that people can't cry and eat something delicious at the same time, but that turns out to be completely untrue, and he spends a week's pay ordering this incredible meal at a restaurant with her. There's a way in which you're sort of we've all turned into information freaks, but we have a hard time evaluating the quality of the information.
Well, that's very true. I think that sometimes we watch the news or we consume media and we come to these ideas about how the world is changing, but maybe one thing that seems very clear now, even though it's probably always been true, which is that every reality is happening at the same time. And that people are constantly living these lives and living in these sort of simulations of life where they construct what isn't true, and then they sort of live within that framework. This is just something I've felt for a while, is... It always makes people uncomfortable when I say this, but I guess I kind of have given up on the possibility that I can control my own thoughts and feelings, and I don't think anyone can. I mean, I just think that in a heavily mediated culture where we're just inundated with ideas and images all the time, and then we also have the limitations of our own biology, the way our mind is a collection of electrical impulses and our body is mostly water and all these things that are tied to laws of physics, it does lead one to wonder how much agency is really left. And I'm very skeptical whether the things I believe and feel have anything to do with me. And if I'm just sort of absorbing all this information, sort of refiguring it in a way that seems original or creative to me, and then injecting it back out as if I built it. And all I was sort of like the racquetball wall that the ball bounced off of.
Although the alternative would be, I mean, in some writers, Pynchon being the most obvious example, and Salinger to a certain degree, Don DeLillo to a slightly lesser degree, William Vollmann. There are writers who just go, you know what? I'm not going to have anything to do with any of that stuff. The only way that I can have an original thought is to essentially stopper my ears and blindfold myself so that I can stay away from the kind of environment, the highly manipulative environment that you're talking about. You've kind of gone in the opposite direction, right? You're very much a part of that ecosystem that you're describing.
Well, it's a very good question, and that's kind of insightful, because the writers you mentioned, I have a huge admiration for that. For the ability to sort of separate yourself from society and kind of work in your own silo of existence. Now, I was a newspaper reporter for 8 years. Then I lived in New York for 15 years writing for magazines. I am generally associated as being a nonfiction writer about the popular culture. It seems as though my entire existence is intertwined with the rest of society and the rest of the world. But, I've moved to Portland, Oregon now, and I write now in a little log cabin in my backyard. I bought a house, and in the back there was a pre-existing cabin, which I had a guy come in. I always kind of say it's like Ted Kaczynski's Unabomber cabin, although this does have Wi-Fi, which he probably wouldn't have liked. No. But anyway, so I made this cabin into like my office, and I am trying to have a life that is a little more separate from the world, because one of the upside to living in New York and kind of being in that ecosystem of other writers and other media people is that you do get smarter. You're just surrounded by really intelligent people all the time, and every idea that exists is almost like a battle. You're always every interaction you have is a kind of a debate over the meaning of things. But the downside is inevitably you do become like other writers. Your thoughts become more shared. They become less singular. And I am trying to get back to that. And I don't know how this book would have worked if I was still living in New York when I wrote it, because it sort of required me to really be, inside myself. It seems like this is the thing you say when you're just trying to sell a book. I'm worried to say this because it just seems so fake to me, but like this is the most personal book I have written. Now, that seems very odd to people considering that I've written memoirs.
Right.
Like I've published memoirs. But those things were about my external life. Like this book is actually about my internal life. And it's like what is happening in my skull alone. And that's a real difficult thing, a hard goal to attain in the modern age.
Right. I think if you were to say to somebody that you didn't know that you were trying to grow close to, if you really want to understand me, read these 34 pieces, you'd scare the crap out of them, Well,
I don't think anybody who doesn't know me would ever conclude that this is a personal book, because there's no signifier in it that suggests that it's me. I think the people who are close to me are probably very aware of it, although I was surprised. My wife was shocked when I said that. I was doing a book reading, and I mentioned what I just said to you, that this was like this personal thing. And we got home that night, and my wife was like, "Why did you say that? That's like a weird thing to lie about." And I was like, "Well, I'm not lying. Mm-hmm. I'm not lying. That actually is true." And she was like, "What?" So maybe it's so masked or hidden that the person who knows me best doesn't see it, but to me it feels so obvious. Like I almost felt it's weird to have these stories. I'm almost too vulnerable in these stories, like too exposed. But luckily, no one else thinks that, so I can just do it.
So you've just done, I think, a 9-city publicity tour, which means you're in cities, you're doing readings, people are getting in line. They want autographed copies of your book and selfies, and you've done this a lot, so you've really kind of gotten to know the Klosterman audience. And I feel like there might be a prototypical Chuck Klosterman fan. In fact, I work with one. There's a guy here at this radio station named Tucker Ives. He's, very much into everything that you do. Have you kind of gotten a sense of who the audience is that you're reaching, who's really responding to what you write?
Huh. That's a good question. Okay, so this is the 11th book. I started doing this in 2001, and the first book I wrote was called Frogger Rock City, and it was about growing up listening to like hair metal in rural North Dakota, like bands like Poison and Motley Crue and Guns N' Roses. When that book came out, of course, it didn't do that well. It was my first book. I was an unknown person, and I do a book reading in say Chicago or whatever, or in Denver. And 11 people would show up, and they would be 11 people exactly like me. I mean, exactly. Like, they looked like me. They liked all the same things. They were the same age. It was like 11 clones of myself. And the second book was Sex, Drugs, and Cocoa Puffs, and that book was much, much, much more popular. In fact, it's basically as popular as all my other books combined. And that completely changed the audience for a while. Okay. And, suddenly there would be hundreds of people there, and half of them would be women, and I couldn't predict who would be there. And it's almost like a bell curve, right? So then you keep touring with the other books, and then there's a period where people go to your readings and they're not even that interested in your work. It's like they've heard about this person on the internet. They've heard other people say that they have an opinion about him, and they almost show up. Spectacle is going too far, but they're not really invested in the work. They're actually invested in the personality. But now I'm on the other side of that hill, right? And the audiences for my book readings are smaller and smaller, and they're, the idea of 200 people showing up, that's never going to happen again. So now I'm getting actually closer. I have a feeling by the end it will be like the beginning.
Those guys.
Where it'll be, except now they'll be like old guys with kids or whatever. I often think to the crowd, because people still show up, and I'm always super flattered when they do. But I think to myself, this is a little like Blue Oyster Cult fans in 1989. It's like they saw them when they were in clubs in the 70s, then they became an arena act, and they were like, oh, I love this band, but they're still going, they're still going, and people are like, does that band still exist? And they're like, oh, yeah, they've had a record out or whatever. That's sometimes what I think about now, that I'm returning to the people who liked the books originally.
Right. So we're going to play a game now called Who Said This to You? So I'm going to read you a quote that somebody said to you, because it's apropos of what we're talking about right now. And then you'll just have to tell me who said it to you, all right? I think there's a space in our culture, in the living memory of people over 40, probably in the collective memory of people under 40, for the American novelist. And for various reasons, after Mailer and Updike and maybe Ann Tyler went into eclipse, there was a wish to have some new people in that position. But culture had changed so much that it became hard for someone to fulfill that role. So when someone came along who could easily be mistaken for that type of novelist, there was a hunger to latch on to that person. Okay, first of all, who said this to you?
Kid Rock. No, it was that was John Franzen.
Jonathan Franzen. Okay.
Jonathan Franzen.
So, but he's talking about a thing that is, when I first realized that you were going to be on the show, I was thinking about that exact thing, that there was a time when writers were pretty visible, and there were certain writers. I mean, you knew what they looked like, you knew what they sounded like. You saw them on Dick Cavett, stuff like that, and that kind of went away, I think, to a certain degree. And I really like Jennifer Egan's book. If you handed me her newest novel, I would read it, but I don't really have I knew what Kurt Vonnegut looked like and sounded like, and I kind of knew how he would handle himself in a Dick Cavett interview. I don't know any of those things about Jennifer Egan, even though I've even seen her speak once. But there's a way in which, for your audience, you're kind of that way, right? These people, the people who like you, they really have a very vivid sense of who you are. I'm trying to turn this into a question, and I don't know how. So go ahead.
No, I know what you're saying. Yeah. I know what you're saying, and okay, on the one side, it's like there's like so many things, there's an upside and a downside to this. Because the upside is that I'm sure that sort of relationship, the idea that people have a sense of what I am like and what I talk like and sound like, has sold more books. I'm sure, I go on a podcast by this guy Bill Simmons, and it's a hugely popular podcast. And when I go on there, I get almost as much attention as I get from releasing a book. I was in a little documentary movie about LCD sound system. Of course, these things probably do help promote the idea of who you are, but there is a downside to it too. When I started this, a compliment I would often see about my writing, and people would have, some people would like it, some people would hate it, but the people who would like it would say, oh, there's a lot of voice to this writing. He's got a kind of organic, natural voice. But here's the deal. If someone doesn't know what you sound like and your writing has a lot of voice, the voice they use is the best version of their own voice. The writing becomes more likable because they almost feel like they are creating this experience they're having. But as soon as people actually know your voice and they know how you actually talk, it becomes impossible for them to read the work without hearing the way you sound. And frankly, some people hate my voice. There are people right now listening to this radio interview and they're like, this guy is annoying. I don't like the way he sounds. I can't help the way I sound. It's just the way I do. Now, as a consequence...
Roy Blunt once said that he hated to do readings because he said the entire point of literature is to get things down in a voice that's actually better than the writer's own. And then the minute you do that, they make you go and read to people.
Oh, yes. It's an odd thing. It also changes the experience. Like, if somebody thinks that my voice is hectoring or grating, they're going to read my work in that way as well. And I do sometimes think that if I had never given interviews, if I had never done podcasts, if I had just been like William Vollmann or whatever, like I have no idea what William Vollmann sounds like. So when I read a William Vollmann book, I'm hearing myself tell me that story. That's a huge advantage. Now, like I said, I'd be less popular, though. I probably would not be on your radio show now. Well, certainly not if I didn't do radio interviews, I guess. You wouldn't have me on. It'd be just, a blank slate. But I think about that a lot. Like I know I'm supposed to be happy about it. I know that, if I do a book event, sometimes I go to colleges, I get paid to talk at colleges. That's a big deal. I should be, overjoyed by the experience, flattered that they want to pay me and all of these things, which is an extension, not so much of my writing, which is partially, but mostly just being a person that they recognize. It's an odd thing. I mean, I have very mixed feelings about it.
Yeah. No, but I know what you're saying. When you were saying that, I was also flashing back. I'm older than you are, and so I had the experience of having been. This is going to seem like not a very good analogy, but that of having been a very dedicated as a child and even a young man. Peanuts comic strip reader. Mm-hmm. Like I really loved the strip. And this is before there were any animations. Yeah. And I think also that you and I probably like the strip for similar reasons, which was that rather than this kind of sunny, ill-advised Eisenhower era, version of cherry-cheeked happy children, it was children as they actually are, or as we felt. They were neurotic and sad and worried. But when they animated it, like the voice of Charlie Brown, all the voices were completely wrong because I had put versions of my voice. I projected those onto the panels of that comic strip, or some version of a voice that I hear, in my own mind. And
I will admit that when I was reading, I probably was. No, in fact, I'm sure I'm wrong. I'm sure that I saw like the Halloween special or the Christmas special of Peanuts before I had the capacity to read. So the very first times I read Peanuts, I'm sure I was using the Charlie Brown voice that I'd heard on television.
Interestingly, you went in the other end of the pipeline then.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And interestingly, though, if you watch the specials, Snoopy doesn't talk.
Right.
So I guess for Snoopy's voice, I'm still manufacturing one myself.
Right.
That's an interesting question. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's something we'll all have to think about for a really long time. But right now we have to take a very quick break. We'll be back with more of Chuck Klosterman after this. All right. We're talking to Chuck Klosterman. His new book is Raised in Captivity, Fictional Nonfiction. I just wanted to say one more thing about this book, which is that when you start reading it, when you read it and become imbued with this particular point of view, then you read other stuff, and it just seems like one of the pieces in the book. So while I was reading this book, Chuck, I read a piece by a woman, a very young woman who's taken over a local dog shelter, and as one part of her training of herself, she slept in a kennel for 7 days. I guess during all 4 seasons, so 28 days, but 7 days in each season, leaving only to go to the bathroom. That was the one thing that the dogs did that she wouldn't do in the kennel. And she writes things like, Then there are the ones who just get there. You see the confusion on their face and feel the intensity of the fear in their body language. They grip so harshly with their paws and claws into the floor, not to be put in the kennel. Once in there, you watch many of them hide in the back or sit in the corner of the kennel. Some of the newbies are immediately so fearful. Aggression is the first symptom they display. And she says, they acclimated to her very quickly. They seem to accept her as another dog. And I'm thinking, are you sure this is not essay number 35 in Raised in Captivity?
Yeah, so she stayed in the cage.
She's in the cage. She's living in a cage like all the other dogs. And she says she wanted to experience what it is to be a dog in a kennel, which is sort of funny, but also it was admirable. I mean, there's something kind of heroic about this.
Well, but, she's only getting halfway there. She wants to experience what it's like to be a dog in a kennel. Well, she's experiencing what it's like to be in a kennel. She's not experiencing what it's like to be a dog.
Oh, so you think she should eat the kibble and she should...
Well, no, she can't. It cannot be done. Like there's a famous essay about like someone trying to understand
what it is
like
to be
how
a bat.
Like a bat. Exactly.
It's Thomas
very good, yes.
Thomas Nadel.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, like and the conclusion is like it can't be done. Like there is no matter how every time you try to get close to the way an animal sees the world, you're still putting it through the prism of what a human experience projected upon an animal is. So, I guess admirable. I guess it is. I mean, she'll know if it's. I mean, the thing is, it's like it's got to be so boring as an adult. Was she reading in there? Because a dog.
No, you can't do anything like that. You can have a book with you.
Well, well, I don't know. I guess good for her.
Yeah, I say good for her. I don't want to do it. You don't want to do it, but she did it. Good for her. So one of the things that I notice about you is, and that I think you seem to subscribe to is participating. We talked about this earlier on, but participating in the culture in a lot of different ways. Participating. You know a lot about sports. You were one of the founders of Grantland, but one of the premises of Grantland was that it shouldn't be sports shouldn't be segregated or isolated from the rest of the culture. All these things kind of intersect in different ways: sports, politics, culture. You like music. You love music enough to have been, well, as you say, you were actually featured in a documentary about a band. In fact, do you have that clip right there? Let's play a little bit of that. Yeah, the music. Wrong clip. B1 is what we wanted. But anyway, forget about that. But you've been in a documentary about LCD sound system. You've done mockumentaries on Documentary Now. And there's a way in which you're sort of refusing to stay in one particular lane. And I'm wondering, I guess, maybe how conscious an effort that is.
Oh, well, I'm conscious of it. I don't know if it's a conscious effort. I do have I guess I was going to say an advantage, but actually it was just luck. I sort of emerged as a person who's like a, writer, public writer or whatever, just before the internet really became calcified and the idea of being a generalist was kind of eliminated. Now the assumption is that if you're going to write about something, you're going to specialize in this one idea, and your value or what you can contribute is how deep a dive you can make into this singular thing. But I was a generalist, and particularly when my second book of essays came out, and there was sort of no clear structure as to what It's like I wrote about dissimilar things in a similar way, and as a consequence I'm kind of allowed to keep doing that. Of course I'm happy about it. I wouldn't prefer a career where I only wrote about the same thing over and over again, although I understand that is sort of just how it has to be for most people.
Although, I wonder if it really... one of the things that I've been thinking about all week this week is Obama, because Obama he and Michelle, I guess, put out their summer playlist, and it's like this 40, you probably saw it, it's 44 songs, incredibly eclectic in its taste. And I think about Obama, who obviously mainly president of the United States, but, who cared enough about sports to do his bracket in public, who would put out a list of music that he liked, who would be harassing Richard Plepler to give him Game of Thrones episodes in advance. And yes, obviously we have a very sort of culturally barren person now in the White House who seems to have very, very few interests. But I liked that thing about Obama, that, he wasn't going to stay in any one lane, and he was going to live life the way that people live their lives who care about culture and who are enriched by culture. And I think it's good. I think it really is an effort worth making not to stay in one place.
Well, it also reflects something about, how you think about things that aren't obvious policy-based questions. When Obama was asked what his favorite television show was, he said The Wire. Okay, and I don't doubt that. I believe that probably was his favorite show. But it's also understandable why a sitting president would say that. It would be one thing you'll probably never hear is you'll never hear a president say they don't like sports. Okay? Mm-hmm. You're just never going to hear that because they do not want to be seen by a populace, part of the populace, as someone who has an adversarial relationship with something that they kind of see as part of their identity. I mean, it's very fascinating to me the ancillary information public figures put out in the world, and we're always hoping that it's completely authentic and guileless, but it rarely is.
Although, actually, if you look at the current field, I don't get the feeling Bernie gives a crap about sports. I would be astonished. Maybe the Vermont Catamounts or something, but
well, that's interesting. Is this not this specific point, but things like that? Is that the reason that there is maybe a ceiling to how far Bernie Sanders can go in political life? Because, if people are drawn to him because it seems as though he kind of talks like a real person. The things that they'd say about Trump are actually very true about Bernie Sanders. But as a consequence, his most ardent followers are very marginalized as being a certain kind of person. And it seems as if when you look at the polling that there seems to be a hard ceiling on what he can do, and is that partly reflected by the fact that he's not willing to, as they say, play the game of what someone in his position does.
Yeah, I mean, it would be weird if, think of all the barriers that he would break. He's Jewish. He's a professed socialist. He denies being an atheist, but in the other times he's appeared to be an atheist. If those weren't problems, but he doesn't know who Brett Favre is, that is a problem. Or maybe you're saying all of those things are of a piece. Well, they represent a certain detachment from the mainstream.
Or an unwillingness to sort of understand that there are some signifiers that a political person, a quote-unquote political person, just sort of adopts reflexively. For a long time, they would have said, well, of course Bernie Sanders can't be president. I mean, he's a socialist. There was, it's interesting when you talk to young people now who can't remember that there was a period where that was like you couldn't have become city alderman if you were going around saying you were a socialist. It was just like an impossible thing. The fact that he had gotten as far as he did as a congressman was amazing, But now that has changed. Now that is seen as a form of populism or whatever. So that's not as a big a problem anymore. However, the kind of personality that drove him to that position, even when it was unpopular, might be in some weird ways an Achilles heel to his overall potential, because people have these expectations. Like you talk about the Obama list or whatever, what would your reaction have been if you're looking at the Obama list of songs and there'd been a couple R. Kelly songs on there? People would have been shocked. They would have been shocked. Now, granted, R. Kelly is a hugely popular artist who's had a huge amount of success in his life, but no one would ever list him among the 40 songs they loved this year. I mean, Obama will list Reeling in the Years by Steely Dan. That song has not really been in the public consciousness for a long time, but he can put that on there and people will be like, oh yeah, I love that.
He kind of went chalk, though, with Steely Dan and Van Morrison, Brown Eyed Girls,
Sure.
you know, which he does with his NCAA picks, too. I mean, those weren't interesting choices. You know?
Yes, I mean, you say going chalk or whatever, that's a great phrase, you know. It's like that's something Sanders does not do.
Right.
You know, he just, yeah.
So as long as we're on this subject, we'll do a little flashback to you talking to Trevor Noah. Hopefully we've got the right clip here.
Is it possible that in another 800 years, this period will seem crazy? It seems very possible to me, even though I don't necessarily know why that will happen.
That begs the question, though. Raises the question, rather. Donald Trump. Could we be wrong?
Yeah, well, because that would be the thing. Yeah.
Could we look back and go, what? He made America great again?
It is sort of this terrifying idea because it's like, well, no one's going around saying like, well, if we can just get him in office, it will be great. That's the problem. Like, there's the assumption, of course, that he's the least qualified person possible to be this far in the race.
Yes.
And if he became president, it would somehow destroy democracy.
Yes.
And yet the thing is, this is happening because of democracy.
So we need to destroy democracy to stop Donald Trump.
It is, it's kind of, it's the paradox of
I think
living.
it's the price worth paying.
That's from 2016. I don't know. React.
To what I said?
Yeah. React to
Well,
yourself.
that was before Trump was elected, and it was so, you know, it's just an interesting period of time. It's like the 4 months before that election are kind of like the 4 months after 9/11, where we as a culture have collectively decided we're going to forget how it was. You know, like we're just going to forget that people were saying the things that we were saying. The night that Trump was elected, I was still living in New York, and I think it was like 7:20 p.m. on election night. I was still texting a friend of mine who was freaking out, and I was like, "Don't worry, there's no way he can win. It's like it's not possible." You know, the thing I was talking to Noah about was that book, But What If We're Wrong, which came out that year, and that was sort of about the idea of trying to think about the present tense as if it was the distant past, because the criteria we use to think about history is so very different than the criteria we use to think about the world as it's happening. Now, since Trump's election, many people have then asked me, it's like, well, you know, is this an example of what we're wrong about? But it's like, it's not as though people aren't going around saying, I wonder if we made a terrible mistake. I mean, if we're wrong about Trump, it will mean that we're wrong about the value of his presidency, which would mean we were wrong about how bad he seems to be performing. But, you know, and that's something that's just an unacceptable kind of thought to have right now. Like, it would be very difficult for any serious public intellectual to be like let's say Noam Chomsky came forward and he was like, you know, there's a lot of issues with Donald Trump, but here is why, in some ways, he has set himself apart from the previous administrations, and you know, like that would end Noam Chomsky's career. You know, like he couldn't. I mean, he's almost dead. I mean, not almost dead, but very old. So it's like like he wouldn't be that. You know, it wouldn't be like he's got to worry about the next 30 years of this. But that's the kind of question that is so kind of profoundly insane. We can't even ask it. Like, society limits us from asking that question. But when you look through this, like the trajectory of history, how many times this kind of thing has happened, where there was a question we were unwilling to ask, and it ended up, you know, it now seems abundantly obvious or absurd. You know?
Right. So we have to pause here. Also, we have a call from Noam Chomsky on line 3. This is going to be so awkward. This is really going to suck. All right. Let's take a little break. We got more Chuck Klosterman when we come back.
So I decided, you know, I was going to work on my voice.
The guys who sang Hi, Michael McDonald, Geddy Lee, you know, Russell Hitchcock, all of those guys. But Clark was almost a different level.
I don't know. I just kind of bear down and I get up there. I can sing pretty high.
Catalina B.
His voice would pierce through, like a bird.
It seemed as if it was being sung, by a woman, or maybe not even a woman, like a really young, very waifish girl.
Didn't want to let Clark hear that.
No, you don't let him hear that. You'd have a boot up your ass real fast.
Falsetto is a very phallic form of singing.
All right, Chuck Klosterman, This Is Your Life. Chuck Klosterman is here. His new book is called Raised in Captivity, fictional, nonfiction. I do recommend it to one and all. That was you in a documentary now. And you're playing there, you're playing kind of a culture critic there in that, right?
Yeah, I'm playing myself. I mean, I am very fortunate. Like, I get to be in the real music documentaries and the fake ones. So I get to be the real rock critic and the fake rock critic. There really is no better job as a rock critic than getting paid to pretend that you are what you actually already have done.
How are you feeling these days about the critic's job, about the whole idea of even being a critic? Particularly, once again, we talked earlier in this conversation about being in this incredible information-saturated environment. We're also in an incredible opinion-saturated environment. I'm wondering how that affects having any kind of critical voice that can make any headway against all that.
Well, there's just been this shift in culture and dramatically in criticism that honestly makes me much less interested in it. Because for the longest period, if you were a film critic or a music critic or a TV critic or whatever art form, a visual art critic, an architecture critic, what you were doing is you were looking at the thing itself and you were talking about music as music, or you were talking about a film as a film. And then from that, you might have extensions of kind of political ideology come out of that. So the best critics were people who could write about a Doobie Brothers record or could write about, Reservoir Dogs or any of these things. And though they were ostensibly writing about that subject, a secondary meaning came out of it that sort of gave it a kind of a cultural relevance and a cultural weight that was really important. But now that has been dramatically reversed. Now basically all criticism is a form of political writing, and that's where it all begins, and the actual artifact is secondary. And that's the only way, as they say, to move the needle. Like, if you look at the new Quentin Tarantino movie, for example. Mm-hmm. This is a great example of it. Okay, so the very first review of that I saw was by A.O. Scott. In the New York Times. And he basically did review the film as a film. He talked about its cinematic elements, its sort of relation to the rest of Tarantino's career. There were a few bits about what the subtext meant or suggested, but for the most part, it was a movie review. Every single thing written about that movie since that first one has basically approached it like it's a State of the Union address. The only thing that they're interested in is, how does this reflect on, does he have a reactionary view about the counterculture from the 60s? Do the female characters have enough speaking parts? And if they do not, is that a kind of a veiled kind of misogyny? Is the violence in this film supposed to suggest that everything about it is about this political meaning that's just a reflection of the critic? I mean, this has happened kind of across the board. I mean, the whole idea in music criticism, for example, which is, I worked at Spin Magazine and I was a music critic at newspapers and all, it's the main thing I'm known for, I suppose. Now it's just this sort of an ongoing argument over, is the artist culturally good and morally correct? And if the artist is deemed to sort of be a morally correct person, then the work is subsequently loved, regardless of what its value is. I mean, I didn't watch the Video Music Awards this year, the MTV Awards, but I read about them. And it's real interesting to me how they've kind of embraced this idea in totality. They have an award for now
good
the
works.
best video for good.
Yeah.
I just that seems
and Taylor Swift won it too.
Yes. I mean, I suppose maybe under the parameters they've created, maybe that's who should have won it. But it's a very strange thing.
Well, I mean, she won for You Gotta Calm Down, which, I mean, it shows that there's a very fine line between altruism and opportunism, right? There's like a lot of people who saw that as her just trying to piggyback onto Pride Month and, you know, just, you know, trying to boost herself using that. And yes, I mean, I don't know how that began. And I think it's appropriate in some areas. Like, I think Bruce Springsteen is a moral force. You know, there's a way in which what Bruce Springsteen does. I mean, he's also really a great rock and roll musician, too.
Well, no, that's a reason to like Bruce Springsteen. It is not a reason to like The River. It isn't. I mean, like, I know, I understand how that seems like a very fine distinction to a lot, you know, to say that, like, but, you know, okay, when I began in criticism, when I started in the 90s, you know what the biggest goal was, and what was the most difficult thing was this idea that could you separate yourself from who the artist is and what the artist does?
Right.
Because the assumption was the average consumer can't do that. The average consumer that was believed will look at someone like Marilyn Manson and find him to be like a repulsive character. So therefore the music is going to be received in the same way. You as a critic must find a way to split those ideas, that you're able to look at somebody and say like, well, this person has these qualities, their work has these qualities, I'm interested in the work because I'm a critic of music. But now it is the opposite. Now, not only are you not supposed to do that, people get angry if you do. Like, people are very upset if I were to look at Bruce Springsteen, for example, if we're talking about Springsteen, and if I would sort of make fun of the lyrics to Thunder Road or something, they would be like, how are you attacking this person? Like, what have you done for the world? You know, I mean, and Bruce Springsteen is a great guy. He is a real good person. You read his memoir, autobiography, however you look at it. Very insightful, very, very thoughtful person. You know, it's hard to hear Bruce Springsteen interviewed without liking him more. Like, anytime I see an interview with Bruce Springsteen, I like him more. But if I'm thinking about his music, it's supposed to be separate from that.
Yeah, although
I
do think, first of all, I should tell you, by way of confession, that in the 1980s, I was a rock critic at a newspaper, and I was the worst rock critic in America. But I do think, like, for example, I reviewed Fleetwood Mac during the Rumors period, a concert of theirs, and I did separate them from who they are, except that even though they insisted on the opposite, right? They were basically insisted, don't make any effort to separate us as people from our music. But when I did, I didn't think their music was very good. And then people got mad at me about that, too.
Well, no, that is fun. You know, when I first did, I did a lot of press interviews for this book, because the book comes out now, like I said, these 9 events, and also do all these radio interviews and podcasts. And it was intriguing to me how controversial people wanted me to be. Like, I do an interview with someone, and they'd be like, what do you think of AOC? You know, it's like, what do you think of cancel culture? All these things, like, every question that I was given for a while seemed to be an attempt to get me to say something that would be viewed as, edgy or problematic or whatever. It was so weird. When I started this in 2001, people would be like, so you think Billy Joel's as good a lyricist as Bruce Springsteen? Very controversial of you. Like, that was seen as controversial then. Having an idea about the lyrical content of pop music was seen. Now that's nothing. Now you can have any idea you want about any piece of art as long as it manifests itself with a political idea that is seen as acceptable. It's a weird thing, you know?
All right. So we have to stop, although I don't really want to stop. I feel like I'm just getting started. But you've got other things to do, and the show's over anyway. Chuck Klosterman, the book is Raised in Captivity, fictional, nonfiction. It's a very, very difficult book to describe or to characterize or to compare to anything else, so you should just read it. And the good news, Chuck, is one of the things that I like about this book is, although I liked almost all of the pieces, if there were occasionally pieces I didn't like as much, they were going to be over in about 500 words anyway, you know?
That's true.
You know,
they're short.
You don't have to slog through something that you really don't like, and you'll just go on to something else. And really, right now, I'm kind of seeing the world through Klosterman tinted glasses.
What color is that?
Well, it's it's dark, but there's little twinkles. It's dark with little bright sprinkles in it. Could you
Maybe
live with
plaid.
that? Yeah.
Okay, yeah, okay,
Could you live with that characterization?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah.
Well,
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. We'll be back tomorrow. We're going to do a show. By the way, Chuck Klosterman, our show tomorrow is about Charles Manson.
Great.
So come back. I'm sure you'd be a good guest on that show too. Tomorrow's show is in fact about Charles Manson. Thanks to Betsy Kaplan, senior producer and producer of this particular episode, Kyone Wolf on the board, making everything sound great as usual. And yes, join us tomorrow for a trip through the cultural impact and actual physical crime, murder committing reality of Charles Manson.